Chapter 22. It was tough going back to school, but I'd sort of missed English. When I got to class, I noticed that Julia wasn't sitting next to Kelly. They must have had some kind of fight during vacation, probably because of the play. On the positive side, it was definitely too cold now for even Mr. Cravuto to think about taking us outside for gym. The ground was frozen solid. But that just meant there was more time for weightlifting. Though the first day back was reasonably easy, things got busy the next day. I had to cover a basketball game and go to play practice. When I got to the auditorium, Mr. Purchall pointed toward the back of the stage and said, "Go report to Ben. He's in charge of the crew." I saw 6 guys sitting around a table playing cards. That was good. There'd be plenty of people to share the load. I figured I'd be able to study and maybe play some cards. "Freshman," one of them said. He was a skinny guy with the kind of acne that looks like it's taken up permanent residence on his face. He was wearing a Phillies sweatshirt with the sleeves torn off. The others looked over. Fresh meat. Fresh blood. A half-dozen fresh phrases floated through the air. The guy who'd spoken first, I guess it was Ben, pointed to a stack of 2x4s. "We need those cut into 3-foot lengths." I stared at him, wondering whether he expected me to do all the work while the rest of the crew sat and played. He stared back and shrugged. Great. I was almost as good with the saw as I was with a wrench. Maybe they'd let me change spark plugs next. I guess sawing uses different muscles than weightlifting because I had a whole new set of sore muscles the next morning. But I forgot all about the pain in my arms when I came within inches of death on Friday. Mr. Franca had sent me to get to the office to get a file he needed. "I'll be with you in a couple of minutes," the secretary said, so I took a seat. A moment later, Wesley Cobble came in. I thought about pretending to be asleep, but then I remembered what had happened to me when I fell asleep on the bus. I had no idea what Wesley might steal from me if he thought I wasn't conscious. Probably a kidney. My attempt at becoming a stealth person failed. There were 3 empty chairs, but Wesley plopped right down next to me. I could feel his eyes on me. I really didn't want to turn my head, but I couldn't help myself. I looked at him and nodded. Just the tiniest, insignificant gesture to show that I acknowledged his presence. I was pretty sure he didn't recognize me, despite the fact that I was one of the many donors who'd contributed to his collection efforts. That part of my plan didn't work very well either. Instead of losing interest, he nodded back and said, "What'd you do to get here?" I realized if I said, "I'm picking up a file for Mr. Franca," Wesley would know I was a goody-goody, well-behaved kid of the sort he enjoyed pummeling. I'd end up on his radar. But I didn't want to risk a lie. So I told the truth. "Perambulation," I said. "Oh yeah?" "Yeah, that's what got me here." "Cool. I was trying to borrow a table saw from wood shop." Phew, that was close. I'd told the truth when I'd said perambulation had got me to the office. It was just a fancy word for walking. It definitely sounded worse, like when people refer to chewing as mastication. Wesley got called into the principal's office. As he stood up, without thinking, I said, "Have a nice day." I flinched, expecting him to spin around and knock me out. What a lame thing to say, especially when he was about to go see the principal. Wesley glanced over his shoulder. "You too, man." A couple minutes later, the secretary handed me the file I was waiting for. By then, my pulse had dropped to a safe 200 or 300 beats per minute. I thought that was the end of my social interactions with Wesley. Then, at lunch, who should perambulate across the cafeteria and drop down into the seat opposite me while I was masticating some macaroni and cheese? Yep, my new pal, right in the seat that used to be Kyle's. Wesley didn't say a word, just chewed slowly at his roast beef sandwich. The silence was driving me crazy. Finally, I said, "You know, Wesley's the name of the good guy in The Princess Bride. That's pretty close to Wesley. It's an awesome book." He stared at me for a moment, chewed another bite, then said, "Oh, really?" It dawned on me that I could get hurt for just using the word princess in his presence, or bride. I nodded and went back to eating, though my throat had closed up so tight I could barely swallow. I could see I could still see the way he decked Mike Clemath with one punch. He'd only need half a punch to flatten me. Midway through lunch, Wesley got up and strolled out of the cafeteria. I noticed kids all over the place glancing at me as if they were trying to figure out where I fit in the social structure. Their guess was as good as mine. January 4th. My arms are going to fall off. Yesterday, I sawed a forest of wood for stage crew. Today, we moved sets all evening at rehearsal. Picture this. 7 guys are carrying a large piece of plywood painted to look like the back wall of a house and weighing nearly as much as a real house. 6 of them are at one end. 1 guy is at the other. Guess who that 1 guy is? If this keeps up, I'll eventually be able to tie my shoes without bending over. There was a student council meeting on Monday. I had the funny feeling that if I didn't show up, nobody would notice. We spent the whole meeting figuring out what each class should sell this year for their fundraiser. The other freshmen wanted to sell wrapping paper. I felt we should sell books. After the meeting, I went up to the advisor and said, "Would it be okay if I quit?" He stared at me like I was a complete stranger. "Quit what?" he asked. "Student council." "Oh, right. Sure, if you want. That would be okay. What position did you have?" "Council member." "Freshman?" "Yeah." I started to leave, then turned back. "Don't you want my name so you'll figure out which member won't be back?" "Nah, I'll figure it out." On the way out, for just the slightest bit, I felt like a quitter. But then I felt like a genius. I was done with it. No more meetings, no more feeling completely ignored. It was probably the smartest move I'd made all year. Thursday afternoon, I was standing at my locker when Julia walked by. I barely glanced at her, hardly even noticed her dark green wool sweater, tan pants, mini diamond stud earrings, or the scent of peaches drifting from her freshly washed hair. Hardly noticed her at all. But a moment later, I realized Lee was staring at me like the two of us were at opposite ends of a microscope. "Isn't that sweet?" she said. "Isn't what sweet?" I asked. "The way your face gets all soft and your eyes get dopey whenever she's anywhere near you." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. Good God, Lee reminded me of Patrick. He'd figured it out right away, too. I felt like that little model of the transparent guy, the one whose skin is plastic so you can see all his organs, especially his rapidly beating heart. Lee's gaze skewered me. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Romeo." I shrugged and said, "So I notice her. So what?" "So talk to her. She's just another person, no better or worse than you. Start a conversation. It beats drooling on your shoes." Good grief. Lee was the last person in the world who should be giving social advice. I shook my head. "I can't talk to girls." Sometimes, right after you speak, you can feel the entire universe shudder. Lee's stare turned into a glare. "Thanks. That's not what I meant." But I couldn't think of any way to say what I meant without digging a deeper hole. "It's not important," Lee said as she turned away. I felt like such a jerk. The next morning, I was standing at the bus stop when a Mustang drove by. The driver hit the brakes, threw the car into reverse, and pulled up to the curb. It was Wesley. Everyone in the group took at least one giant step back. Wesley leaned over and rolled down the passenger window. "Hop in." I figured he was talking to someone else, so I didn't move. But he looked straight at me and said it again. I got in. He's not the sort of person you say, "No thanks," to. We shot away from the curb before I could even buckle my seatbelt. Behind us, I heard Mouth calling, "Hey, can I get a ride?" When we reached the parking lot, Wesley hopped right out, said, "Later," and headed into the building. Inside, I noticed that Lee had a bunch of rock stars on her locker. All the ones I recognized were dead. Underneath, she'd written, "Only the young die good." I nodded at her in the hallway. She stared at me without nodding back. I thought about putting a picture of Beethoven on my locker. He was the most famous dead musician I could think of. January 12th. I finally figured it all out. It's too late for me, but at least I can pass this along. Don't talk. Not at all. From the day you walk into high school to the day you leave, do not utter a word. Because if you do, one way or another, you'll get some girl angry with you. There is no such thing as an innocent comment. You might want to avoid hand gestures too, and anything else that might carry meaning. Facial expressions, deep breaths, loud thoughts. By the way, if you need any wrapping paper, let me know. I have to sell 30 rolls. Monday morning, Wesley picked me up again, but he stopped to get coffee at the diner on 8th Street and have a couple cigarettes. We got to school a half hour late, and I smelled like smoke. Wesley gave me a ride home after detention. I miss getting smacked in the head. At least it's quick and has never been linked to lung cancer. Tuesday, I got to the bus stop as late as possible so I'd miss Wesley. There was a new kid in my seat. A big new kid. The driver started shouting, "Take a seat! You're holding us up!" I had to sit in the back, with the felons. By the time I got to school, I'd loaned all my lunch money to my seatmates. And my calculator. At least they didn't take my sneakers. I miss riding with Wesley. When I got the paper, there was a headline saying, "Big shakeup on student council." Wow, I never thought I'd make the front page. I started reading the article. Fortunately, there was enough noise around me to drown out the swear word I shouted when I finished the first sentence. It seems I wasn't the only freshman who decided that council wasn't a lot of fun. The president and vice president had quit, which meant that the new freshman class president was the person who'd gotten the next highest number of votes. Julia, Madam President. That wasn't the only change. We had a different teacher in Spanish, Mr. Camber. I guess Ms. de Gaulle had gone back to France, or maybe to Madrid to confuse the locals. I thought my worries were over until Mr. Camber opened his mouth. His accent was so thick, it was like listening to someone speak backward. And he was chewing gum. From the few words I could understand, I was eventually able to figure out that he was from Australia. After he told us about himself, he started the lesson. It went like this. Mr. Camber said something that might be Spanish, like Ramblen, pastin, te ennoculacha. One of the kids in the class said, "I didn't understand that." Mr. Camber shrugged and said, "No worries, mate." And it continued. Tunco queb mis de cufalucha por abanque. Huh? I don't get it. No worries, mate. Enchefolaca si muarbla docho. What? I didn't understand that. No worries, mate. After I'd heard no worries, mate a half dozen times, I finally figured out he was saying no worries, mate, which I guess is Australian for you're screwed and there's nothing anybody can do about it. I missed Miss de Gaulle. Wednesday morning, I showed up early enough to catch a ride with Wesley. When he pulled away from the curb, I said, "You going straight to school?" He grinned at me. "Want to go somewhere? I'm cool with that." "No, that's not what I meant. I need to be on time." He stared at me, which made me even more nervous because he was still driving. My reluctance to lie vanished. I've been late so much I'm already in big trouble. One more time and they might throw me out. "I hear you," Wesley said. He stomped on the gas. Tires squealed. I was pushed back against the seat as the roar of 8 cylinders blasted my ears and a fog of burned tire particles coated my lungs. I think I'll always be able to look back at that moment as the exact instant when I knew for sure I had no desire to be an astronaut. "There's lots of time," I shouted, forcing the words out against the pressure of acceleration. I doubt he heard me. He was too busy taking a turn on 2 wheels, which must be even harder when you steer with one hand. Wesley screeched to a halt in front of the school. "Sure you don't want to grab some coffee? Nothing goes on during first period anyhow. Or second. Teachers aren't awake yet." "Thanks, but I'd better get inside." "Whatever." He peeled away, leaving me to wonder whether, instead of gas money, I should be offering him tire money.